would like to talk to you today about building Docker extensions using Vue and Nuxt. My name is Evan Harris, and I am a software engineer at Slim.ai. At Slim.ai, we are working to enable developers such as all of us to build secure containers faster. And ideally, we want to enable developers to both be able to bootstrap cloud-native applications as well as leverage Docker containers in their local environment to just improve the quality of life in your development loop. So what are we going to talk about today? First, what are Docker extensions? This is somewhat of a novel feature set, so I want to go ahead and dive into that. What does it mean to develop a Docker extension? As well as if you are trying to use Nuxt and Vue, what does it look like to ship a Docker extension using those technologies? So what are Docker extensions? For those of you who are familiar with Docker Desktop, this screen might look moderately familiar. The new feature that you can see in the left-hand nav is this little extensions dropdown. It's in beta right now, so they have a little don't use this in prod disclaimer. But if you click the Add Extensions button, there's this extensions marketplace, of which the extension that I've been working on for the past couple of months is available. This isn't the only entry point to add extensions. You can go to pretty much any image on Docker Hub or any public registry, pull it down to your local machine, and ingest this into the Docker Desktop application via the CLI. And the Docker Desktop docs are pretty good. So this is really, I don't consider myself to be a container expert by any means, but if you can sling JavaScript, you can really break into this environment. So if you want to go ahead and try your hand at developing a Docker extension, what are some of the things that you should keep in mind? The first of which is a file called metadata.json. And if you were to look inside of the code bases of any of the currently available Docker extensions, every single one of them will have this file. There's some top-level metadata, the name, the provider, but the more interesting piece that I'm really going to focus on today is the UI element. And if you're shipping an extension that has a UI that you could access via that left-hand nav dropdown inside of Docker Desktop, this is what you're going to be serving there. So what do you want your extension to be called? Where will the business logic of your extension live within the side of the Docker container that you're shipping? And then what is the source for your code base? And at the bottom of the screen, there is another field where if you want to ship maybe a small backend, a little RESTful API that your UI can talk to, you can use this key value pair of VM and compose file to explicitly declare what other services your application can take advantage of. This is just an example Docker file. Definitely doesn't work by any means, kind of cut out the middle here, but it follows a typical multi-stage build pattern. The top half of the Docker file, we are initializing everything that our application needs, our UI application needs in order to run. And in the latter half of the file, we are saying, please copy all of our build output. So I built this Docker file using Nuxt 2. And for those of you who are familiar with Nuxt 2, it defaults to outputting to the dist directory. And I basically am saying, hey, copy everything from the dist directory into my UI directory, which if we take a look back at that metadata.json, we are saying the root of our UI is the UI directory. So you're looking for parity here between these two files. And the last line in this example Docker file is where if you were to include a small API to ship with your UI, you effectively have some arbitrary binary that you would run in order to support. What could your Docker Compose file look like? In this example, you really only have one arbitrary binary. We call it app in this case. It's referencing a Docker file, which we just looked at, as well as some image on my local machine. Here we're calling it slim.ai-dd-extension, and we're talking about the latest image. And if you want to expose ports in order to interact with other elements on the local machine, you can do that as well. And you can include as many services here as you want. If you want to run Mongo locally or other databases, you can really pick whatever you would like to deploy. So what does it mean to create a Docker extension using Nuxt and Vue? For those of you who are familiar with Nuxt, a nuxt.config.js should be a pretty familiar concept. And one of the gotchas that I ran into here was in my very first initialization of this Nuxt 2 application, I was able to spin up a Docker container, run it locally, but as soon as I tried to put it inside of the Docker desktop environment, which is an Electron sandbox that I don't really know where the edges are, I wasn't able to access any of my JavaScript files, which is kind of a problem. I discovered that if I made a slight amendment to the build configuration of my Nuxt output with this line of config.output.public path, I was then able to see basically losing all of my error traces about my JavaScript files not being found. And so what does this actually look like inside of the container? This is just a small screenshot of the HTML file, a 200 HTML file specifically. And you can see that the /_Nuxt is now prepended to every JavaScript file referenced there. Before, the HTML files wouldn't have had this. I don't quite remember what the path looked like, but really you didn't have a UI application until you made this change. Another issue that I want to point out, and this is actually still live, so I have yet to resolve this bug, and definitely going to try to leverage that debugging class from earlier to try to fix this, but this is a Vue Monaco package, and what you're supposed to see here is some nice syntax highlighting on an HTML file, as well as some little carets that would enable you to expand and close any little code snippets. But this is a problem that you could potentially discover, not even if you're using just Vue Monaco, but any package where you don't control the CSS importing, you will really have to discover this process for yourself, but just something for you all to keep in mind. Another piece that I ran into, and this could be more due to Dockerizing Node or Dockerizing Nuxt rather than putting it inside of Docker desktop extensions in particular, but I tried to bootstrap this application just with a basically greenfield Nuxt 2 app, and following their examples, I started with some hard-coded paths referencing local images. You can see I have a /layers.svg. And none of these images were being found when I actually shipped these containers inside of Docker Desktop, but they were running fine when I had it inside of a locally running Docker Compose setup. I worked with my architect, and basically we found out all you have to do is rip out all of the local or the relative or absolute pathing. And this was due to a little quirk in how Docker Desktop actually loads your application. It was ingesting your local home directory, which once you're actually inside of Docker Desktop is never going to find your file. And so really what I would like to call out today for everybody is this is a very new field, and so far there's not a lot of other people that are building, or at least I haven't found them yet, not a lot of people that are building Nuxt and Vue containers inside of Docker Desktop. And I would love to encourage all of you to give it a shot. Their documentation is really good, and if you're like me and maybe you haven't used containers before, I just got into the system 4 years ago and still learning every day. The Slim.ai extension you could actually use to look at images on your local machine. And this is just a small screenshot of what the container that I've been delivering looks like when you load it into the extension. Connect with us on socials and check us out. Reach out on Discord if you have any challenges. And thank you.